Hello, welcome to the Honest Wargamer. I'm your host Rob, and this video will be a complete guide and review of the General's Handbook 2023. I know it's not out yet, but the entire book has been leaked on the internet, and so is a full early review. The General's Handbook is a publication that comes out from Games Workshop every 6 months. It has new rules on how to play the game, as well as an ongoing meta-narrative for the universe of Age of Sigmar. Combine that with the core rules and FAQs, as well as rules you can find in your battle tome, and you have the whole ecosystem of how to play games in Age of Sigmar. Most, if not all of these rules, can also be found on warpedia.ru. Think of it like this: the edition, and we're in the 3rd edition, is the game. The General's Handbook is like the expansion or the DLC, and the FAQs and Battlescroll updates are like balance patches. The GHB is a expensive publication with a limited shelf life, 6 months. Everyone's circumstances are different, so I'll let you tell me in the comments if it is something worth picking up for you. I personally never pick it up. I prefer to digitize it in some way. It's much easier for me to carry around the information on my phone rather than a big book, which I know I'm going to throw away 6 months later. Right, so what's in the General's Handbook? What's in it? There are rules for Galletian Champions, 3 new battalions, a new realm spell, a new command ability, 2 new heroic actions, 3 new artifacts for Galletian Champions, 4 unique enhancements for Galletian Champions, 6 grand strategies, of which 3 are new and 3 are holdovers from the last book, 8 battle tactics, of which 4 are new and 4 are holdovers, and then 12 battle plans, of which 6 are new and 6 are from the last GHB. There is also a Battlescroll update that's leaked that we'll go through in detail in another video. It's got point changes for every faction, which, along with the removal of the Bounty Hunter and Unmatched Conqueror battalions from the last General's Handbook, will shake up the game significantly and deserves a separate video. So for this GHB, the major focus of the rules is on Galletian Champions, or is what the game devs would like it to be. It's one of those unintended consequences sometimes when you shake up the rules for what is a very complicated game. They may well want it to be all about Galletian Champions, but it might not necessarily end up being that way. Okay, so what are Galletian Champions? Well, they are heroes of Gallet, of course, but also they are heroes with a wounds characteristic of less than 10 that do not have a mount and that are not unique, gain the Galletian Champion keyword. So examples of this would be a Lord Relictor, or a War Chanter. Characters like Sigvald or Gotrek, who are unique characters, would not be Galletian Champions. Galletian Champions gain access to the Key to Victory and Desperate Action special rule, 2 heroic actions, 3 grand strategies, 4 battle tactics, 4 unique enhancements for Galletian Champions, and 3 artifacts for Galletian Champions only. There'll be a video coming soon for each faction and the champions and the best loadouts to maybe equip them with. Galletian Champions are going to be very important in certain missions and as a way of scoring certain battle tactics. They gain an advantage on the tabletop with 2 new rules. The first one is the Key to Victory. Friendly Galletian Champions cannot be picked as the target of attacks made with missile weapons while they're within 1 inch of any friendly battle line units. They can still be the target of spells and abilities. It's just missile weapons that aren't going to be able to target them. This is a huge update. Formerly, what we call foot heroes could be -1 to hit from missile weapons thanks to the Lookout Sir special rule. However, being completely untargetable and a lot more safe means that they'll be able to maintain and increase the viability of certain armies. However, there is a downside because there is a battalion, which we'll talk about later, which will mean that they are no longer safe. Foot heroes have always been support pieces in Age of Sigmar. The lore might describe them as a mighty lord of conquering and destruction. However, their rules do not really tend to match that. We actually did a video about this. We talked about the swashbuckling foot heroes of the mortal realms and how they really don't buckle any swashes in any way. So go check it out. As support pieces, though, they're fantastic, and in some cases very necessary. Here are a couple of examples. The War Chanter for Ironjaws can make a unit have +1 damage on the melee weapons for all of a unit. Losing the War Chanter to some range threats meant the output of the army would be halved. A Fluxmaster for a Disciples of Tzeentch army not only generates fate points the army will use for summoning, but provides a -1 to hit bubble for Tzeentch demon units around it. These heroes increase an army's viability, but very rarely are they fighting whole units on their own. Some do. Examples are Sigvald, Gotrek, or the Light of Altharion, but those are unique units and so can't become Galletian Champions. So keeping these characters safe is going to be important for some armies and might make them more effective. But, like the last GHB, Games Workshop have put a counter to all of this in the form of a battalion called the Sharpshooter Battalion. Okay, so a quick note on battalions. When you build an Age of Sigmar army, you're allowed to take units and put them inside battalions. A unit can't go in more than one battalion, and you can take multiples of the same battalion unless you're taking battalions from the General's Handbook. I said battalions a lot there. These battalions bestow effects on units inside the battalion, or they give you bonuses like letting you take more magic items or have lower drops. The Sharpshooter Battalion allows you to ignore the Key to Victory special rule, which means you can just target the characters like you would normally. The units that can go inside of the Sharpshooter Battalion are infantry. Infantry is a new thing. It's a unit of 4 or less wounds that isn't a hero, monster, or war machine. The battalion requires 3 infantry units. All units in the battalion can then ignore the restriction on shooting Galletian Champions. The battalion making it so that shooting armies might not be one-drop Alpha Strike armies is actually really interesting to think about when we look at building new lists in the new GHB. Normally, an army wants to be as few drops as possible to detect the flow of battle. This is the purpose of the Battle Regiment Battalion, which normally you'll see lots of armies inside of. In fact, the Battle Regiment Battalion was the second most popular battalion in the last GHB after Bounty Hunters. My mind is already racing on what will be the best Galletian sharpshooters. Who will pincushion a hero across the mortal realms? And it's such an exciting thought that we're going to do a top 10 Galletian sharpshooter unit video soon. So this is where the game is going to enter a diverse play state. Some armies will have champs, some armies will have sharpshooters, and some armies won't have either. Let's look at that now. First, and sadly the worst category, armies that do not have champions or sharpshooters, and this is the Sons of Behemet. Armies that have champions but no sharpshooters are Soulblight Gravelords, Ossiarch Bonereapers, and Blades of Khorne. And so they're going to be in positions where they have champions on the board but are unable to deal with the opponent champions unless they beat up the rest of the army. And then in the last column is everyone who have champions and sharpshooters. Some armies really get in there with just a technicality, looking at Slaves to Darkness. Some armies have got amazing sharpshooters and really survivable champions. Unless Sons of Behemet get an update, at some point they have no access to champions or being able to deal with them. This will likely seem unfair to Giants players, but they're such a skew army that they will often be left out of dynamic game states, and that's okay. Consign them to jolly games over beers and meat pies as they would want. While having excellent champions, Soulblight Gravelords, Ossiarch Bonereapers, and Blades of Khorne won't be able to deal with the opponents at range. This makes some matchups highly difficult as they deal with your champs and you can't get theirs. You can just always kill the battle line in front of them though, so I guess it's clobbering time. So just a quick recap of what we know so far. Galletian Champions are heroes that aren't unique, with a wounds characteristic of 10 or less and are not mounted. They can't be targeted by missile weapons, but spells and abilities will get them. And there's a battalion that lets you ignore it and shoot them. Another battalion you can take is the Galletian Command. It requires 1 champion and 1 infantry unit. You gain access to the United in Purpose ability. This lets you fight right after the hero in the battalion does in the combat phase. The infantry unit inside of this battalion, though, becomes a sworn bodyguard unit. So we needed to look at the battalion so we could understand the sworn bodyguard rule so we could talk about the heroic actions. The second special rule that Galletian champions gain access to is desperate actions. The Desperate Action special rule says that if you are going second in a battle round, then you gain access to the ability to do 2 heroic actions instead of 1. There are 2 new actions, but this gives us a new lease of life for a bunch of characters that may want to be doing a heroic action like heal using heroic recovery, or to gain a CP, or you may want to try and gain a command point, and also you want to try and unbind an enemy spell using heroic willpower. Now, this obviously only applies if you're going second in a battle round. However, because you can do 2 heroic actions now if you go second, that does mean you can use the 2 new heroic actions in this General's Handbook. Strike at the opening allows your champion to fight in the hero phase, and Lead by Example lets your sworn bodyguard unit from the Galletian Champions Battalion also fight in the hero phase. However, they can't fight twice in the hero phase and must strike last in the following combat phase. This will be a massive damage increase for some armies in the game, especially if you're building counterpunch style lists. Immediately my brain goes to the most fighty units I can think of going twice, once in the hero phase now and once in the combat phase, but you do have to strike last. But I'm not sure what unit I want to do it with. Let me know, comments below, what you're going to use. So here's a quick recap. There are 2 new heroic actions that combine with a battalion to make a unit fight in the hero phase and at the same time as a champion. However, it requires you to go second in a turn, so you are less likely to have the chance to have the choice of turn 1 due to being higher drops. I think taking a battalion that might allow me to fight if my champion hasn't been shot by a bunch of sharpshooters is probably not something I'm going to do, but I can definitely see some players doing it. It also would make a pretty cool narrative unit where there's the champion and his heroic bodyguard next to him, but ultimately my kind of competitive sense doesn't make me want to do it at the minute. Okay, so let's talk about the new unique enhancements that you get from this General's Handbook. So normally when you build an army list, you're able to take a command trait and an artifact in your army, as well as 1 mount trait and sometimes other things that your army book allows you to do. There are battalions that allow you to take additional ones of each of these enhancements. Each one of those, a command trait, for example, or an artifact, is an enhancement. So there is a battalion where you can, for instance, take another artifact. The General's Handbook introduces the aspects of the champion. So this is another enhancement type that you're going to be able to take in your army list. So you can always have 1 free aspect of the champion. This is cool because this is a straight up power grade for some of your heroes in your army. The first one is Tunnel Master. And this is once per battle. Instead of picking a Galletian champion to make a normal move, you can remove it from the battlefield and set it up again on the battlefield more than 9 inches from all enemy units. This will give characters that were traditionally very slow a teleport. Some really interesting combos with this. Fueled by Gurist Rage is once per battle before you allocate a wound or a mortal wound to this Galletian champion, and that wound or mortal wound would cause it to be slain. You can roll a dice, and on a 3-up, that wound or mortal wound is negated. You can heal up to D3 wounds allocated to it, and any wounds that currently remain to be allocated are negated. This is great if you're running limited champs and you want one that you're using to stay alive and keep scoring points. The next artifact is Stubborn as a Rhinox. This lets a Galletian champion count as 10 on an objective, as long as there are no other Galletian champions attempting to contest the objective as well. This is excellent, because being able to hold your back objective safely, especially with a single character, stopping deep striking small skirmish-style units, like Shadow Stalkers or Tree Revenants, is a real nice little upgrade for a unit that's normally going to stay at the back of the board anyway. Leadership of the Alpha is once per battle, this Galletian champion can issue one of the following commands up to 3 times in the same phase: Rally, All-Out Attack, All-Out Defense, or Redeploy. If it does so, no command point is spent on the 2nd and 3rd times. This Galletian champion issues the command in that phase. This one seems the most obvious. Being able to rally 3 times, especially if you're able to rally on a 4+ or a 5+, as opposed to a 6, means that you can really scale your army in its ability to heal and recover models. And it's free. It's just a free, new, unique enhancement. The next set of enhancements are simple. These are artifacts. You find artifacts in the core rulebook, and you find artifacts in your battle tome. These are exclusive to Galletian champions, but they have to compete with current artifacts, especially the Arcane Tome. The first one is the Tusk Helm, and it makes you do mortal wounds like an ogre monster on the charge. The next one is the Nightflyer Cloak, and it lets you deep strike a champion, which is a great utility for some armies and keeps them safe for turn 1 shooting. The last one is the Griffeather Charm, and it gives your character a ward save of 5+. It might be the most common one we see, as it provides real protection to heroes who are vital for scoring points. Okay, and now for a couple of additional things that anyone can use. The first up is a realm spell called the Grinding Teeth of Gallet. This does D6 mortal wounds on a 4+ for each unit within 6 inches of an objective. The wizard casting has to be within 12 inches, but obviously you can use the Umbral Spell Portal Endless Spell, which lets you cast through it, giving you a 30-inch effective range. In my opinion, this is crazy powerful and a little silly to have in the game. It's pretty game-changing, especially if you roll the big 4-up and then the big 6 for mortal wounds, and will really undo some really clever play on maneuvering that an opponent may have done. Even if you rewrote the rule and it happened on a 5+ and it would be D3 mortal wounds, it's genuinely a really, really good spell. However, it does combine really well with a certain style of army list. Reign of Stars is a list that we've talked about a bit on the show. and the Technado of Petrification are all army lists which will utilize using this spell to add to their arsenal of AoE mortal wound damage. I'm going to make a list review and hopefully interview some of the players who play those lists later to see how they feel about this new inclusion to their arsenal. There is also a realm command called No Retreat, No Surrender that's really good for combat-orientated armies. It adds +1 attack to the melee weapons of a unit, excluding the mounts, but you can no longer pile in. It means you won't be using all-out attack, as a unit can't be issued more than one command in the combat phase. More attacks is usually better than +1 to hit, but it comes at the cost of not piling in. This is going to be especially useful on units that can pile in and attack twice, like Iron Jaws or Chosen. So there's a real buff to combat armies in this version of the General's Handbook. Potentially make it so that they can fight in the hero phase, and also they can strike at the same time as a hero in the combat phase, plus the addition of adding +1 attack to their melee profiles. So while the conversation for a while might be about who the best shooters are and who the best champions are, there's definitely a really deep set of math you can do and look at which might be the best combat units to work with your Galletian champions on the front lines. Lastly, there is a battalion called Galletian Veterans. Its ability, the Bonds of Battle, lets you fight in 2 ranks as you can in the old GHB season. It would be nice if this was just FAQ'd as a core rule, but instead, you do have to have a minimum of 2 infantry units to a maximum of 4 infantry units. This is especially good for horde units and is really good in conjunction with the command ability for the realm, because you won't be piling in, but you can strike from a 2nd rank +1 attack on all of those models. It's going to be really interesting to see how much this is used in the game, or if it's only certain armies that really try to utilize it. Before we take a look at the grand strategies and the battle tactics and the battle plans, I think it's time to do a quick recap. Champions can definitely help combat armies with heroic actions and the new command ability to build some truly fighty units. There are no bonuses to shoot the champions versus the state they are in pre this GHB, and there are artifacts and unique enhancements to build better champs than are available now. This feels like a great opportunity to build some cool combos, maybe even kit bash some champion models and have real fun. Balance-wise, I think there are some haves and have-not armies, and that's super rough to feel like you're missing out on the fun, or even worse, you have a target on your back. I'm excited to find out what the lists and the results from tournaments start to tell us about the game. There are 6 grand strategies, 3 from the last General's Handbook, and 3 requiring Galletian Champions. A grand strategy is something you write on your army list when you write it down, and you complete it at the end of the game, and if you do, you score 3 victory points, which generally can be a big swing in your favor and win you the game. The first 3 we're going to look at are from the old General's Handbook, and thanks to everyone at the T-Sports Stats Center, we've got the information on how many times these grand strategies were taken in events previously. Take What's Theirs was the most popular grand strategy taken in the last General's Handbook. It was taken 28% of the time. When the battle ends, you complete this grand strategy if there are more friendly than enemy units wholly within the enemy territory. The reason I think this was so popular and made so much sense is most of the time you're going towards the enemy to try to kill them and take all of their stuff. This means you normally have a lot of your dudes in their territory, and hopefully most of their stuff is dead. As a mirror to the first one, we have Defend What's Ours, the grand strategy that was taken 7% of the time. When the battle ends, you complete this grand strategy if there are no enemy units wholly within your territory. On paper, this makes a lot of sense, especially if you're building something like a castle army, where you're looking to defend your territory and project power at range. The last one from the last General's Handbook is Tame the Land, and this was only taken 1% of the time. When the battle ends, you complete this grand strategy if you control all of the objectives on the battlefield that are wholly outside your territory. This is just very tough to do, so don't take that one, is the easy answer. Now we have the 3 new ones, and they all require Galletian Champions. The first one is Stake a Claim. When the battle ends, you complete this grand strategy if 3 or more friendly Galletian Champions are wholly within enemy territory. This is just, don't do this. This requires them to be alive. That's difficult at the end of the battle. To go across the board, that can be difficult to do because they're slow and they're on foot. And so just don't do this one. The next one is Survivor's Instinct. When the battle ends, you complete this grand strategy if the model picked to be your general is a Galletian champion and that model is contesting an objective wholly outside your territory. Again, it requires that Galletian champion to be alive and for them to be contesting an objective. It's just, again, is probably not one you're going to take. The last one is The Day Is Ours. When the battle ends, you complete this grand strategy if there are more friendly Galletian champions from your starting army than Galletian champions from your opponent's starting army on the battlefield. This actually seems like a pretty good grand strategy if you're already starting with a lot of Galletian Champions in your army. Again, if you're also building a list that's designed to kill a bunch of Galletian Champions, then maybe also this is the one for you, because you can really make sure you get this pretty early with sharpshooter battalions and the abilities to kill these champions at range. All in all, there seems to be 2 or 3 of these which are pretty good and ones that you may take in your army list, but they are army list dependent and also army book dependent. Now, there are also a bunch of grand strategies that you can take from your battle tomes, but we're going to have a big conversation about that at the end of the video about how that might look. Next up, we're going to look at the battle tactics. There are 8 battle tactics, 4 from the last General's Handbook and 4 for this General's Handbook, and 4 of them require Galletian Champions. You choose a battle tactic at the beginning of each of your player turns, and then you try to complete it by the end of your player turn. And this gets you 2 victory points. 3 for a grand strategy, 2 for a battle tactic. Now, I've put the old battle tactics in order of which I think they were easy to complete in a game. Now, that could just because of the armies I personally played, though, so maybe your ordering would be different. The first one is Desecrate Their Lands. You pick one terrain feature or faction terrain feature that is partially or wholly within enemy territory. You complete this battle tactic if you control that terrain feature at the end of this turn. Now, the key word in there is partially within enemy territory. That means you can just have a giant house or a chaos dreadhold just tiptoeing its way into the enemy territory, and then you can just run to it from your side of the board and claim that battle tactic very easy. The next one is an eye for an eye, and this is normally a mid-game battle tactic. You complete this battle tactic if 1 or more friendly units were destroyed in the previous turn and 1 or more enemy units are destroyed during this turn. This is pretty good because you don't have to nominate a unit, it's just kill a unit. So if it does look like you're going to potentially kill multiple units, then this one's a really easy pick. If there's not many things that you can do, and this is you've got to kill the unit in front of you, which is pretty much what you do in Warhammer anyway, then this is a really easy one. The next battle tactic is a win more battle tactic, which means if you're already doing well, this means you're going to do even better. It's called Gaining Momentum, and you pick one enemy unit on the battlefield. You complete this battle tactic if that unit is destroyed during this turn, and you control more objectives than your opponent at the end of this turn. So if you're already in a good position and potentially going to hold more objectives than your opponent, and you have the ability to kill an enemy unit, it feels like you're just snowballing and having a win more situation. Lastly, we have This One's Mine. Pick one enemy unit on the battlefield and you complete this battle tactic if that unit is destroyed during this turn by an attack made by the model to pick to be your general. Now, some generals are just better than other people's generals. One may be a sickly wizard looking to cast a spell into the sky, and the other may be a frost lord atop a stonehorn. So this is just easier to complete for some armies than it is for other armies. Therefore, there's a bit of disparity with this one, and this means that of the 4 old ones that have carried over, 3 are more likely to be done by everybody, and this one is a little bit more difficult for some other armies. The 4 new ones all require Galletian Champions. Maneuver is you pick one friendly Galletian champion on the battlefield that is more than 3 inches from all enemy units. You complete this battle tactic if, at the end of the turn, that Galletian champion is more than 3 inches from all enemy units and is contesting an objective you control that is wholly outside of your territory. Now, this is just basically claiming an objective with a champion with a few extra words and steps in it. It does have to be outside of your territory though, and some of the battle plans are going to make this very, very difficult to achieve. However, some of the unique enhancements like the teleport or the deep striking mechanic might make this easier to do, so it's kind of an interesting one. The next one is United Offense, and you pick one objective controlled by your opponent and you complete this battle tactic if you control that objective and 2 or more friendly Galletian champions are contesting that objective at the end of this turn. Again, this is really difficult. If your opponent's contesting it, then that means that your Galletian champions have to get there, and normally they're going to be quite slow and they're going to be on foot. So this is going to be a real challenge for some armies. The next one is a Matter of Honor, and you pick one Galletian champion or sworn bodyguard unit on the battlefield. You complete this battle tactic if that unit is destroyed during this turn, made by an attack by the friendly Galletian champion or sworn bodyguard unit. Now, if you're building a sworn bodyguard Galletian champion combo here in your army because your army just tends to play really well that way, then this is one for you. Or you might just have a really fighty Galletian champion, like a tyrant, for instance, that's going to go beat people up. However, some of you may just, again, have very frail combat characters, and then this one might be a lot harder to achieve in the game. So, grand strategies and battle tactics are how you score points other than holding objectives. We'll look at the battle plans in a minute, but there's a really good conversation to have about how we're going to score points. Now, book tactics or battle tactics and strategies that you can find inside battle tomes are not created equal. Some have really good ones, some have really bad ones, and everyone will argue that there's a good or bad depending on which side of the fence you're sitting on. However, they're definitely not made equal. And in this particular season, it doesn't seem like the grand strategies or the battle tactics are made equal either. I do really worry for some armies that have bad book tactics and don't necessarily have really good ways of either dealing with the enemy champions or not. And so you're going to get maybe some haves and have-nots. Now, maybe that's just first edition fear. The first time I've read it, I haven't really walked it all the way through, but it does seem pretty accurate looking at it. And so it's going to be quite interesting looking at the packs that tournament organisers put out. If you're just playing a game at home with your friends, it doesn't matter really. Just enjoy yourself and have some fun. But when it comes to the tournaments and how people balance games, or at least try to use the missions to make it so the game has got a little bit for everyone, I think it's actually going to be a really difficult tightrope to walk. There are 12 battle plans in this GHB, 12 missions to play through. Now, 6 are the same as the last General's Handbook, and we got 6 brand new ones. 5 of those require Galletian Champions to be effective in the missions. So it's very possible that you could build a battle pack requiring no missions that have Galletian Champions in. Again, that's kind of the conversation I was having before. It's going to be really interesting building these packs for people to play at tournaments because those mission choices are going to be very important. A tournament is normally 5 rounds. So picking the perfect set of missions is going to be very tough, and your opponents are definitely going to work out the best armies they can play in those missions, so working out how to play them is going to be really important for you. Right, let's look at the 6 from the GHB previous. The Prize of Gallet is the most popular mission played in the last General's Handbook. It has 5 objectives and you start 22 inches apart. You activate one of the objectives in Battle Round 1 if you go second, and every battle round after, whoever goes second activates a new objective. One of the tricks of this battle plan is to go second in the first battle round, pick an objective that works really well for you, and then if you win the priority going from 1 into 2, is to also give it to your opponent so you can choose your home objective to be the second active one. This means you're most likely to score more objectives than your opponent and then hopefully just go up on points. However, there are loads of counterplays to that. It's a really fun and engaging sort of mission, and that's why it's probably the most popular one that was played in the last General's Handbook. Also, don't forget, there's no proving grounds anymore as there was in the previous General's Handbook, which meant that you can make it so only Galletian veterans could contest an objective, and therefore that's opened this up to play for loads of new armies. Ogres, as an example, who generally didn't take many Galletian veterans in their army. The next up is the Realmstone Cachet, and shockingly was in 9% of mission packs in the last General's Handbook. You start 22 inches apart in a very condensed territory, difficult for armies with lots of models or even with terrain features that they have to set up in their territory. There's 1 objective in the middle, and then at the beginning of Battle Round 3, there becomes 2 objectives. I find this wildly dull because you're all running towards the middle at the start of the game and then hoping it gets somewhere near where you want it to be towards the end. Battle Lines Drawn was only in 2% of all battle packs. You start 18 inches apart and there are 2 objectives. The territories in this are objectives, and one of the reasons you probably didn't see it played much was in the previous General's Handbook you weren't able to teleport units while playing this mission. This meant that armies like Sylvaneth were really nerfed and hampered by this mission, so people didn't generally tend to put it in packs. However, that's been taken out, so it'll be interesting to try now. I'm not too excited at potentially the Realm spell making it so that all of 1/4 of the board is going to be exploded, but we'll see. The next up is the Lurkers Below, and this was chosen 3% of the time in the last General's Handbook. You start 30 inches apart and there are 3 objectives. You must control your home objective before you control the center objective, and you must control the center objective before you can control the enemy objective, and once you control all 3, you automatically win the game. Again, I've never been a particularly big fan of this because it's an auto-win condition, which really works well for some armies. Plus, you're just going in a very linear, straight line, which I generally tend to find quite boring. If you want to make it a little bit more interesting, put a couple of impassable pieces of terrain in the middle of the board, make it so people have to go around a little bit, maybe. It's just walk forward, which is not really what we want to encourage in Age of Sigmar. The next one is In the Presence of Idols, and it was chosen 11% of the time in the last General's Handbook. You start 18 inches apart and there are 3 objectives across the center. Each player nominates 3 idols in their army at the start of the game, and if one of your idols kills one of their idols, then they become America's next top idol. No, they get an extra victory point. This is a fun one. This is kind of interesting in some ways. A really astute general keeping an eye out for their idol, killing the opposing idol to make sure they get some extra points. It's kind of fun, and you can see why it was chosen a lot. The Nidus Paths was chosen 11% of the time. You start 18 inches apart. There are 4 objectives. But you can teleport between 2 different corners, which is kind of fun. You add this weird kind of deep striking mechanic to some armies who don't normally gain access to it, and you make it so your opponent always has to guard their back objective. I quite like the Nidus Paths. It's pretty simple and normal. The inclusion of the teleport is quite fun. Yeah, this is a good one. I would take this. Okay, let's look at the new battle plans. Ooh. The first one doesn't require you to have a Galletian champion, and might be one of my favourite of the new ones. It's called the Jaws of Gallet. You start 18 inches apart and there are 5 objectives. But from the start of the second battle round, anyone going second can destroy one of the objectives. This is pretty cool because if you lose the priority roll, it can feel like the world is ending, but then being able to delete your opponent's objective is quite fun. Really powerful units such as Archeon knowing what the next priority roll is going to be really interesting as well. So there's going to be some real fun stuff done on this mission, especially around the priority roll, and so there's going to be some real head-scratching moments, and that is really what makes the game super fun. Onto the missions that require Galletian Champions. The first one is Only the Worthy. You start 18 inches apart and there are 4 objectives. Galletian Champions effectively have what we call OBSEC. So Galletian Champions are the only units that can contest an objective unless the opponent also has a Galletian Champion. This is a really interesting one because you're going to want to get to those Galletian Champions, maybe even shoot them off the board, but they're going to hold those objectives better than anything else around them. I personally think there are going to be enough ways to deal with Galletian Champions that maybe it's not going to be a huge issue, but yeah, it'll be an interesting one. Not really sure so far. Battle of a Champion, you start 18 inches apart and there are 4 objectives. If a champion is holding an objective outside their territory, then you can attempt 2 battle tactics instead of 1. Now, there are 2 objectives outside of your territory, and being able to achieve 2 battle tactics is wicked if you have got loads of options to achieve battle tactics. Like we talked about previously, the Galletian Champion ones are pretty tough to do in some situations, and some people don't have very easy book ones, and some people have very easy book ones. So you might end up in this situation where some armies just really have a wealth of battle tactics to do, and some of them have a real dearth of battle tactics to do. So this is kind of an interesting mission because it really will showcase who does and doesn't have the ability to do those things, and also that they need to get to the objectives, and again those foot characters will be fairly slow. The next one is Ours for the Taking. You start 11 inches apart, close enough to spit in their eye, and there are 3 objectives. Home objectives are worth 1 point, and the enemy's home objective is worth 2 victory points. The center objective is worth another victory point, but if you hold it with a Galletian champion, you get a bonus victory point. Now, because of where you deploy your armies in this one, if you look at the territories, you can absolutely load all of your army in front of your opponent's home territory and their objective, but also that means yours is incredibly lightly defended. This is going to be so interesting because I actually think this really doesn't benefit one-drop armies. I really like this one. This is one of those ones that's very brutal, very front-facing. Maybe the smart players just deploy heavily on your own home objective and then push into the center and mid-board and not worry too much about their objective. Either way, what a fun mission. Really looking forward to seeing how this plays out. The next one is Twists and Turns, and there are 5 objectives, and you start 18 inches apart. At the end of each player's turn, after points are scored, each objective controlled by the active player is rolled for, and the objective stays active if you roll a 4+, or if you've got a Galletian champion contesting it, then it happens on a 3+. So that's at the end of each player's turn. However, you only roll for it if you're the active player, and you only roll for your objectives that you control. And then, at the start of each player's hero phase, the active player, so whoever's taken the turn, rolls a dice for each objective they control, and on a 4+, or a 3+ if you've got a Galletian champion, the objective becomes active again. This is wild. This is an absolute mess of a headache, and I'm not really sure if I love it or hate it. Generally, missions that work on RNG have feel-bads. You could be dominating the board space, but you just never roll a 3-up to activate your objective, or to keep your objectives active. And that can feel crazy rough. However, looking at the actual mission, there might be something where you let your opponent take the objective, find out if they keep it, take it off them. There could be some really interesting kind of pre-planning that you do going into it. But the problem is all that pre-planning is very orientated on a 3-up dice roll. And that is going to change the shape of a game just because someone got a little bit unlucky. Sure, I know we roll dice in Age of Sigmar and in Warhammer games generally, but this one feels like it's really exciting, but also could be really rough just because you didn't roll a 3-up. The last mission is Position over Power. You start 18 inches apart and there are 4 objectives. At the start of the 4th battle round, the objectives on the flank vanish. Galletian Champions who contest the flank objectives gain an additional victory point. It's a pretty simple one, but if you actually look at the flank objectives, they're very far from where you start the game. So being able to teleport, move, run, fly, or a bunch of other things to get those objectives is actually going to be really hard for those Galletian Champions. In fact, a lot of Galletian Champions being on foot make me really go back and rethink some of those upgrades that you could take with the teleport that you can see available. Armies that already have their own teleport are also going to be really strong in a lot of these missions for their ability to put Galletian Champions in places you weren't necessarily expecting them. We're going to do a detailed Tactica video on all of the battle plans in the future. The GHB also contains information on all of the endless spells that you can buy. However, there are no changes to any of them, other than the book was obviously written before the nerf to the Purple Sun. So hopefully that will get FAQ'd back again, or it doesn't, because I personally love the Purple Sun, so let's go back to having it how it was. Okay, before we get to kind of my thoughts and feelings on it, I do have a Patreon. If you'd like to help support the show, that would be really awesome. I'm hoping to bring you a lot of videos over the next few weeks about this battle pack and all of Age of Sigmar. So if you want to help support the show, that would be really sweet. And I very much appreciate everyone who already supports the show on Patreon. This battle pack is super interesting because it kind of feels like you can ignore loads of it, but also you can't ignore lots of it if you're playing certain parts of it. I know that doesn't seem very astute as an observation, but I think it's got some merit. I think you can definitely write whole mission packs for tournaments that just completely ignore Galletian Champions. The problem is there are so few battle tactics available for some armies that they're going to have to use their book battle tactics, and as soon as you put those in, I think that there's some imbalance between all of the book tactics as they sit right now. This means that you kind of think, well, just go straight into doing all the Galletian Champion missions and bring those in. And then, are they going to be, like, is there a power level where they're all the same? I'm not really sure. It's really fascinating. That's why I want to make so many videos about it over the next few weeks, because there's so much to deep dive. It feels like there's some real winners, right? Like Lumineth have got the ability to have really good Galletian Champions, and they can shoot from crazy far and just murder stuff. Same with Stormcast. Great Galletian Champions, and they've got long strikes, and they could just shoot champions from afar. So some of those seem really interesting, but the Sharpshoot Battalion and then also the Battle Regiment Battalion being at odds with each other is also very, very interesting. Then there are armies out there like Iron Jaws who just keep everyone honest and just run at you and just beat up all of the dudes protecting you Galletian Champions. Overall, it's proper fascinating. And we haven't even looked at all of the points reductions and increases that are happening in the Battlescroll update. So ultimately, it feels like a brand new playing field. Of course, some of the units that were already good are probably going to stay good. And of course, some of the units that are bad probably going to stay bad. But this, in conjunction with the Beast of Chaos book, the Gits book, the points reductions, I think it's going to be a really wild time on the tabletop, and it seems fun. I do love the idea of kit bashing my own champions and really looking at those foot characters, which ultimately have been overlooked a lot in Age of Sigmar. I hope you enjoyed the video. There'll be more to come. Lots of love. Thanks to everyone who supports the show already on Patreon, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, leave comments below, talk about how you feel about it, and share it with your friends. Thanks for being an honest Wargamer, and I'll see you soon.